Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar session, second in our wellness series called Job Burnout, Signs and Coping Strategies, featuring Dr. Anissa Moody, New York State licensed psychologist and director of St. Joseph's College Counseling and Wellness Services. Before we start, please make sure that you can see and hear us clearly on your computer, phone, or tablet. You can open the chat box by clicking on the chat icon. To hear audio for the webinar, click on the phone icon. This is only if you haven't already dialed in via the email instructions that we have sent here. Okay. My name is Dee Kaler. I'm the Associate Director of Alumni Engagement at St. Joseph's College, Brooklyn campus. I'll be your host for this session. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. Please note that a recorded version of this webinar will be available on our website. We will be sharing the presentation slides with all participants and sending out a survey for your feedback and thoughts following the webinar. If you have any questions, please hold on to them. We will be addressing them at the end. Make sure to open the chat box by clicking on the chat icon and typing your questions. Throughout this live session, we would also love to hear from you on social media, so please feel free to connect and chat with us through Twitter and Facebook. Our Twitter and Facebook handle is @SJCNYalumni. If you hashtag, please use hashtag SJCwebinar, hashtag SJConnect, and hashtag SJCNY. I now would like to introduce today's presenter, Dr. Anissa Moody. Dr. Moody is a psychologist and educator in New York City. She has over a decade of experience treating individuals with significant stress-related health concerns and specializes in treating trauma and anxiety with non-medication techniques. By sharing her expertise on current topics, Dr. Moody aims to raise awareness of mental health and highlight the importance of mental hygiene in enriching people's lives. Dr. Moody was the host of Frame of Mind, a weekly show that explored mental and emotional health topics with expert opinions. She's currently affiliated with St. Joseph's College, Brooklyn, as well as the City University of New York. For those of you joining us, we'd like to welcome you. Our presenter, Dr. Anissa Moody, will talk about what job burnout means, its causes, and how to prevent it. Now, without further ado, I'll turn over the time over to Anissa.
Thank you for the introduction, Dee. Whenever I talk about burnout or when someone comes in to see me and I'm assessing them, one of the first things that I like to do is make sure that they have some type of understanding about how they feel personally. So an assessment, an initial assessment, which is what you can see here, can help you have some understanding in terms of how you're personally experiencing burnout. I like to ask about physical symptoms, such as how you're feeling physically, emotional energy, as well as a cognitive perspective, your thoughts, ideas, and, of course, your feelings. How are you irritated? How do you interact with your coworkers? Motivation is a huge component when it comes to considering burnout. How do you feel about how you're achieving? How do you feel about your job? Do you feel like you have time? Because one of the things when people are stressed out that oftentimes comes up that they tend to ignore is procrastination or how they manage time and feeling like they don't have enough time to accomplish things, whether that be professionally or personally. The major component that I included on here in this assessment too is how you feel about your chosen profession. Right? Because that's a key piece that sometimes, because work can be something that we do to survive or to make ends meet, we don't necessarily get to ask that question, and we don't connect that to our physical and emotional well-being. So as part of this whole, framework, I think it's quite a necessary question to ask when we're assessing work burnout.
And I think we have a short clip that we'd like to show.
Because sometimes I think this clip is necessary, because sometimes we think it looks like this. Yeah, that's pretty funny. And, you know, what's really funny about it is that most of us would never do this. And there's humor in this video, but it's also important to point out that the idea of work burnout, even when we consider the lexicon in the American language that's used to describe burnout, it's like going postal. We always feel like there is this extreme response, and one of the things I want to emphasize throughout this presentation is it doesn't have to be extreme at all. All right? So as we talk more about burnout, I think it's important to define it. And I think one of the things that most people, especially when they talk in my office about it, experience is this: they're not so sure in terms of what they're feeling. They, in fact, sometimes don't even have the language. And one of the things I emphasize for them, that what they're feeling in relation to work is real, that you absolutely feel burnout more than you think about it or even have the language about it, for it. In fact, there's a large percentage of the American population, about 70% of people who are not engaged. And a lot of that engagement has to do with having a negative emotional response or just being stressed out as it relates to work. Now, as you can imagine, burnout does not start immediately. It's more of a process, and it's typically a reaction to the ongoing daily grind. Now, the daily grind at work doesn't necessarily have to be related to physical exhaustion, but it can be related to the expectations. It can be related to the emotional labor, which is oftentimes discounted in our culture, the emotional labor that we put into our work, the dedication, the relationships, the motivation, that relates to how we work. And what you find a lot of times is there's this emotional exhaustion that happens, and you start seeing your work as a separate entity, oftentimes a negative entity that relates to what you do. I have to go to that place again, right? That's a depersonalization, as though you're not connected to it or it's something that's hoarding over you. And your personal goals, your accomplishments, oftentimes can feel diminished in those environments. Now, there is no, and I have to make this clear, there is no mental health diagnostic called burnout. There isn't that. But what we do know is that there are many stress-related disorders, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, that does qualify and does relate to burnout. Okay. Now, there are many symptoms of burnout, and what most of us typically you'd think we would pay attention to is the physical symptoms. We don't often recognize these physical symptoms are related to work burnout. When you're physically stressed out, when you're emotionally stressed out, you're more likely, more prone to immunological disorders. Your resistance is down, so you're more prone to physical illness. Right? In fact, burnout is linked to many diseases, in addition to immunological diseases like heart disease. And when we talk a little bit about personality, we'll also talk about how burnout relates to personality and cardiovascular disease and diabetes. When we talk about diet, too, and I'd like to add in here with diabetes, is a lot of times when you're in a stressed out place, you crave, for those people who are more prone to emotional eating, you may crave foods that may contribute to poor health, including diabetes. Now, the thing that I think is oftentimes much more quickly identified and where people would respond to and come in to see me is the emotional responses. Feeling depressed. One of the worst feelings is to get up in the morning and to not want to go to work, right? That heavy feeling that comes over you. Or to feel anxious about a job, a boss, co-workers, about meeting expectations. These things are definitely quite an emotional burden that oftentimes contribute to some of these other symptoms as well. A huge piece to consider that we'll talk about throughout is control, the axis of control. when you're feeling stressed out, oftentimes it's a feeling of, you have no control over your environment, you have no control over probably your future goals, which can lead some people to act out aggressively, emotionally aggressive, snappy at coworkers, or you can feel, hypersensitive. But a key point I always like to raise is the role of empathy as it relates to, just interacting with human primates, interacting with human beings towards each other, and how when you feel stressed or you feel like there's a lack of care towards you and you feel depersonalized, it's hard to be empathic towards others. And I think that's a critical point for a lot of us who work with other people, especially in human services, teachers, many different fields. Now, cognition, or how you think, thinking skills, that's oftentimes a factor when you're burnout. You feel like, an example I make all the time, reading the same thing over and over again, not being able to just compose an email, right? Because all these feelings, or you can't think clearly because there's so much going on, or you feel like if you say something the wrong way because of the hypersensitivity. And sometimes I've worked with people, and one of the things that, they felt so relieved to learn that it was more burnout, not that they were losing it, quote unquote, was how they started seeing their coworkers, feeling judgy of others or having negative views of others. Sometimes it's a sign of just the environment and just needing to sort of take care of that part of ourselves. Now, behaviorally, again, along with the attentional problems, the hyperactivity, reactivity, when you're stressed out, your frontal lobes, a little bit of science here, your frontal lobes become sort of not as in control as they should be. And what that might mean is that you might act out impulsively, things that you wouldn't typically do when you're burned out and those frontal lobes have sort of gone kaput. Well, you might say the wrong thing, you might do the wrong thing, or act like those people on that video.
And just lose tolerance.
Right, absolutely. Motivation, and this is, I think, a very specific and key point, because part of why a lot of us work is for productivity, right? And it's a part of our desires to be connected to something. And also when you're young in your career or different points in your career, motivation is necessary in order to move you along. However, what is oftentimes misunderstood when you're burned out is that disillusionment, being discouraged, does not have to do with age. It doesn't have to be sometimes with how long you've been in a role. It might be, again, a symptom of where you are in terms of your stress levels. A job where you don't feel valued, where you may, feel like you're just a cog on the wheel. Demoralization certainly affects the way in which you function at your workplace. And all of that leads to, life and job dissatisfaction. So all of these symptoms by now should pretty much tell you that burnout is a pretty significant symptom affecting many different parts of your life. And it takes a biopsychosocial approach to sort of understand all of the impacts. So who gets burnout? I love talking about this because this is very important to look at different levels. So at organizational levels, jobs where, and this is very important to understand, jobs where you have low autonomy, going back to that control piece, or where you have to do repetitious or routine work, oftentimes leads to feeling burned out. Not to say that in those roles one can't have enjoyment, but it has to be very thoughtful in the structure of the job where you build in something novel, new, and give people more of a sense of control. That term, postal, actually does come out of research that looks at how maybe some people in certain type of work jobs, work tasks, like certain specific roles in the postal office, do the same thing over and over again, and how that repetition oftentimes leads, again, to desensitization and a feeling of, right? So that's very important to consider. Can you make choices in your workplace? Do you have autonomy? Can you work well being micromanaged, right? Are you in a place where you are physically uncomfortable? There's quite a bit of research that looks at the role of being able, how employees who can control the temperature where they work, how that impacts their level of stress. If you have to go to work in a place that is totally uncomfortable and you have no control and no one is responding to you, right?
And you will feel burned out.
Right. Work pressure. For people who work in, high stress with high stakes, and the outcomes, mistakes can mean, that fatal outcomes. Air traffic controllers, emergency room workers, crisis counselors. Those are jobs where, yes, there are lots of stress. And even, I hear this all the time, managers would say, well, you knew that about the job and it takes a certain personality. You may know that, but then that means not that, okay, you know that, so then you have to, turn yourself inside out to meet that. No, what it means is you have to consider how to tailor the work role to make it humane, so people can survive in the role.
Absolutely.
Right.
And also make it more engaging for those people. So
Absolutely.
they feel like, their contributions mean something.
Absolutely.
And then we have lack of supervisor.
Yeah. Well, you are in a situation where you feel alone because supervisor abuse isn't necessarily always about things that are added on or done to. It can also be neglect. So in a role where you literally get no support, so you're on your own, or if you just have a supervisor who's kind of sucky and abusive, or, there is no support in your role. And support, let me make it clear, support means that you get feedback. You get, communication in terms of how you're performing. And feedback that is, to use your word, is engaging in a way it can help you improve, not necessarily an attack on your being, which is a huge thing that when you hear people talk about feeling really stressed out at work, is that the feedback that they're getting isn't constructive, right? It doesn't help them move to improve whatever it is that they need to work on. It's more critical and personal. So, and a huge piece here too is also how much control do you have within your work role? How can you enhance the work that you already do and feel supported by your supervisor? You have no control over that. That can feel like a dead end.
You might feel stuck.
Absolutely. And there's nothing worse than feeling stuck, right? Yeah. So at the individual level, there are many things that we can talk about, but at the top of the list are the perfectionists. Now, perfectionists love their perfectionism because it works well for them, right? When you're a perfectionist, that oftentimes means that you are very conscientious about what you do. You do things in a way where the outcome is oftentimes meeting the demands of the job, and that usually you get good feedback and a lot of rewards. What is oftentimes not taken into consideration by the perfectionists themselves is the impact that you're doing to yourself, because there is no such thing as perfection, right? So this whole idea of things have to be exact, things have to be a certain way, there has to be a desired outcome every single time is really a very unfair and stressful thing to do to oneself, because what you're doing is you're always pushing yourself, and then what happens when things don't go as it should?
And most likely you're sacrificing from your own personal well-being
Right.
to contribute to that outcome, which in the long term is actually
Absolutely.
not the best way
Right.
about it. So.
And perfectionists are very hard on themselves. They beat themselves up better than anybody else on the outside can, right? And in certain occupations, I just mentioned this before, where the stakes are really high, and so are the demands, but the support can be low, and you're sort of like a lone soldier, and everything that you do as an individual person has a direct correlation in terms of how it affects others. That can be very stressful. So occupations, again, like emergency room workers, mental health workers, teachers, police officers, where you don't necessarily have the opportunity in those roles on a daily basis in your job to have buffers, to have support. One of the things that mental health workers have done, and I appreciated this when I worked on a trauma unit, with a trauma program, we had throughout the day groups where we could support each other. because it was very obvious that we were in a trauma and we listened to very negative, harsh things, and it was very stressful. But I think because we were in a trauma unit, we thought that way. I wonder sometimes for many other occupations where, again, there's the daily push, a lot of the demand for your time, your attention, and quick decision-making, if there could be opportunities for, buffers and time in between, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. People who like to be in control of the environment, right, that's tough. And I separate that from perfectionists because those are two separate ideas. You can like to be in control of your environment, not be a perfectionist. Introverts, for example, oftentimes like to be in control of their environment. And if you know that about yourself, and if you don't, you're here thinking about that for the first time, it's important. The type of work that you do can be very stressful because if you're in an environment where you have no control, you will always feel assaulted by the environment. Mm-hmm. You will always be assaulted. So the example here of having a bad boss, if you like to be in control of your environment and you have a micromanager, you have someone with poor boundaries, meaning they come into your space and
managing you, scrutinizing every detail.
Or you're in a room with lots of different people and you have no control over things. Mm-hmm. Those are those small things that you might feel like ashamed to complain about or talk about. But it does create daily wear and tear that contributes to an overall burnout. Mm-hmm. And as I mentioned before, we're introverts, and I'm a low I on a Myers-Briggs. Mm-hmm. And I love knowing that about myself because it does make a difference in terms of how I understand how I work, where I get energy from. Mm-hmm. So introverts get energy from within, unlike extroverts who get it from being with other people. So what that means is if you're in a job where a lot of time you have to spend interacting with people, giving a lot of human interaction and contact, answering, giving energy, you're going to get burned out if your personality and your energy level style is to fuel from within.
That makes a lot of sense. I recently read this article, and it was talking about, the recent trend towards creating these open spaces at work where people work in these cubicles or entirely open spaces, but that's actually, in some workplaces, instead of contributing to productivity, it actually led people, led to lower productivity because it didn't really match with the personality of everyone in that workspace. So. Okay, so let's move on to preventing and treating burnout.
All right. So I love this slide because the key to treating burnout, like a key component, this point is about looking deeply. At the core of the matter is assertiveness, right? If you are able to assert your voice, use your voice, talk about your needs, even if they're not met, and that's the research across the board, then you decrease, the probability of being burned out. It's when you allow the environment to act upon you, and you say nothing, and you hold it in, and you don't increase your awareness about what your needs are and what you're feeling, and you don't say anything or do anything about it. Again, even if you don't change the outcome, just talking about it and asserting it and knowing what your needs are makes a world of difference in how you experience it. All right? And that relates to this whole idea of being resilient. Now, one of the things, the biggest, I think, misunderstanding of resilience is we have this idea that resilience is something that some special people have. You're lucky if you're resilient, or when something happens to you and, people say you're so resilient. Actually, we can build resilience. Now, what we know is that there are certain people who have what we call hardy personalities. These are personalities, they take a beating and they can keep, going, and it seems as though that the adversities of life doesn't necessarily wear on them. Yes and no. Hardy personalities tend to be people who experience adversity, but they use skills, communication skills, and humor through it, right? Type A versus type B personality types, very important to understand. Now, type A personality types tend to be the hard driving. competitive people, versus type B tends to be more laid back, team oriented. Who do you think is more likely to experience burnout? That's right, the type A. When you're always swimming upstream, moving towards a goal, and you don't necessarily take a moment to self-reflect, or self-reflection oftentimes is in terms of how do I get to the next goal. Yeah. And remember I was saying how some of personality relates to physical symptoms and disease? Type A's are more likely to suffer from heart attacks, cardiovascular diseases, and burnout. All right? So there is a lot of benefits to sort of sometimes taking things easy, being reflective, and being a little bit internal. A sense of humor goes a long way, and you do find what people who type B tend to not look at life so seriously, or look at all of the little outcomes that seriously. A sense of humor will take you a long way. And a huge piece that I oftentimes work on with people, and with a lot of students here, is purpose. Okay, how does this particular job, this particular role relate to your overall goals? See, it's surprising how much more you can tolerate, or how much more things make sense or don't feel like they were outside of your control, even the most minuscule role, right? If it relates to an overall purpose and an overall goal. All right? Optimism. Now, here's the thing that I oftentimes hear from some people, especially when you're already depressed and anxious. It is really hard to be like, really optimistic about what? Optimism is a skill. And it's not, again, like resilience is not something that you just, you either were born in a home with fairies or optimistic people. No. It's really about learning to look at things in a way where you can see that this particular experience, this particular role can, again, going back to purpose and commitment, can, serve this purpose, not only for me, but community, people that I work with. You have to be able to make the commitment. And I teach optimism quite a bit, and it's quite necessary.
It's just like a resilience, it's like a muscle.
Yeah.
You have to keep working and building.
Yeah. And resilience works more towards the feeling piece, right? The optimism is more of the thoughts, the cognitive, like that's, I always think of it as a cognitive motor to keep you going, right? And all of that relates to personal stress management skills. I say to people, like, what are your coping skills, stress management skills? And I wouldn't, a lot of people say exercise, and that's great. A lot of people say wine drinking, and sometimes that's not so great, right? But what I think is very important, especially from early on in your work career, is developing a way of coping and identifying what you do, and self-care. Self-care isn't incidental. Self-care has to be intentional. So when people exercise, I say, great. But then I also assess to see if exercise is just something that you do. Is it a body image thing, or are you thinking in terms of how you feel? So mindfulness techniques are very helpful for making it very clear that you're intentional in self-care. Hobbies and activities. I actually work on that constantly. Hobbies and activities. And I say hobbies and activities that have nothing to do with the role that you're in. Because if it's, for example, if you're a type A personality, and I hear this a lot, golf is great for work because I get to network. Well, then how enjoyable will golf if you're on the 11th hole and, you are thinking about, well, this person doesn't seem committal, right? You really have to think about how those hobbies and activities, if it's about self-care, right? And occupations that foster on power dynamics, so our last point here is pretty important, because if you understand that you're in an occupation, for example, as an accountant, and I understand as a lead accountant and all these different, if you're in an occupation where there's power dynamic and there's no conversation about it, you're more likely to, again, going back to that control, feel more stressed out. If you're in an environment where there's an understanding of power dynamics and clear communication, clear discussions, in fact, in the world of nursing, they do an awesome job in the research of talking about how power dynamics between doctors, between nurses, between the lead nurse, how that affects the stress in the environment. So I think power dynamics, understanding that, since it's a clear-cut role in a workplace,
You need to
it's
communicate about it.
yes, and it's a great lead-in for that. So I love talking about what to do, how to take charge for your next step. So I separated for employee and manager because I think it's important for managers, and let's not speak only to the employees, because managers have a role in this. So as an employee, the first step you can do is take an assessment. At the end, we have some references as well as the beginning. There's a brief one. If that seems familiar to you, then definitely I think take an extended one. But expressing your needs and concerns, assertiveness, I can't say that enough. And keep in mind, even if what you wanted has not been met or you think it won't be met with the outcome that you desire, just expressing your needs and knowing your needs can make a difference. Vacation. And there's a lot of studies that show that Americans don't take their vacation. Culturally, we really just don't. We leave a lot of a table of days on the table. And some people are thinking right now, that's because of work, I can't do it. Well, planning breaks and vacations or thinking of smart ways, if you can't take a full week, then add days on. Take off a Monday, take off a Friday. You have to get those days. Wellness programs, a lot of insurance companies have wellness plans with things like massage, all sorts of different provider incentives. Perks. Absolutely. Alternative treatments. I recommend those a lot in terms of, again, a self-care plan. And, of course, I'm going to say therapy. Talking about it, and what I find most of the time that therapy helps is a lot of people think that there's something wrong with them, and they never consider that it could be your daily wear and tear. All right? As a manager, one of the things that I always stress is if you're seeing that your employees, like you have a lot of turnover, or you're feeling worried as a manager, what I hear quite frankly is, I think that my employees don't really like what they do or like me, but what am I doing wrong? I think looking at the job, looking at how the employees work, and maybe looking at ways in which you can create more stress relieving activities, more downtime. Yes, I said it, more downtime in a job redesign is necessary. 360 feedback gives your employees more control to talk to you about how they feel. I know that it can feel very uncomfortable to hear your employees tell you how they feel about you, but in the long run, it's much more helpful because not giving them a voice and that top-down process of you saying, you need to do this, work on this, it's helpful for the overall job, but in terms of morale for the employee, 360 feedback, the feedback, the research is much more positive. Management training and wellness platforms are very important. Now, what we find is that now managers should definitely be trained to understand not only outcomes in terms of the bottom line, but outcomes in terms of employee wellness.
Thank you so much, Anissa. I'll now go ahead and take some time for questions. Just as a reminder, please be sure to type your questions into the chat box. I'll start off with the first question. I'm curious if you think there are differences between men and women in relation to their susceptibility in response to job burnout.
Yeah. When you look at the stress studies, what you find is, first of all, a main difference in terms of coping skills. Oftentimes, women are diagnosed much more quickly and promptly because women are socialized to verbalize the emotional needs. Men oftentimes will do things that may be more unhealthy, but increasing exercise is not unhealthy, but things like drinking, smoking, or working more, developing workaholic tendencies instead of verbalizing their needs and desires. And we socialize women to talk about how they feel about their work. I mean, there's a lot of sexist views to this whole idea of women's work being optional. But because the positive to that whole idea is that women are oftentimes given options, whereas with males, you sort of have to stick it out. You have to move towards a very specific goal. You have to be, the stereotype is you have to be aggressive, assertive, and highly motivated, even in a role that you're not necessarily that interested or receiving any type of positive gains from. So you definitely do see a difference in terms of who talks about it and who's more likely to treat it. You do find that males tend to have much more negative outcomes in terms of stress and work burnout. Heart attacks, perfect example. Immunological diseases as well. Women, again, are more likely to talk about it, but women are oftentimes viewed more negatively in the workplace because of their expression of how they feel. You know, you talk about how you feel in the workplace, and you may get, you know, a negative perspective, even if everyone else is feeling like how you do. Oh gosh, she's so negative, such a complainer. Whereas a lot of times, when men talk about their experiences, people are more likely to respond and want to coalesce around their expressed concerns.
It's an issue of the need to break those stereotypes.
Absolutely.
Really. And also the managers to be cognizant of these gender, like the differences in the way that the genders react to this.
Absolutely.
So absolutely. All right. So if you have any questions, please let us know. I have one question here, and that is, do you think media should play a greater role in raising awareness about job burnout?
Yeah. I think one of the things that we struggle with in our culture is, and there's a lot of discussion. Ariana Huffington has started this whole thing with Thrive, and you know, there's been some with, you know, Facebook. Sheryl Sandberg, right? The lean in movement. I think that we glorify this whole idea of overworking and productivity. Now, there are some other cultures who do this as well, but in our culture, we, you know, somehow attach success to work, and to, you know, that vocational sphere. And, you know, this whole idea of, you know, a person who, you know, takes care of themselves, self-care, we still in the media don't have good models of that. We're working on what that means. But, I mean, even think about technology and how, you know, we hyper-focus on social media and and technological advances. We don't necessarily have a good language, is not a clear lexicon for what it means to be balanced, what it means to be self-aware, what it means to take care of yourself. It's just the media typically focuses on, you know, productivity, and all of that. That's sort of where we are right now.
Related to that, does research show differences in the level and response to burnout across different cultures?
Oh yeah. I mean, you do find in America, and there's some cultural pieces. But in America, we tend to have more stress-related disorders, right? Now, in Japan and China, they do have somatic disorders, which are stress-related and work-related, but they tend to view it a little bit differently than we do. Here, we definitely carry the load in terms of work-related, stress-related disorders. The thing that's really interesting is that there's no counter to that. Like, there's no...
Are there practices in other cultures that might actually be, shed light on
Absolutely.
how the types of approaches that we should take here to alleviate the problems related to job burnout and maybe change the culture around
Absolutely.
And this incessant focus on work.
Well, you've heard other people in countries talk about holiday, all right? When they take holiday, and I love it, and they're gone for like a whole month, or a 2-hour lunch break. Right. Tea time. It's my tea time. And I think we make it, even listen to my tone of voice, we kind of think it's funny that someone would leave work for a whole month, but it's really about self-care. You know, in France, that whole month of August, in addition to their holidays, nobody's really working in that whole month of August. People in lots of other countries take their life, leisure time very seriously.
Mm-hmm.
And, part of our society is about contributing in a productive way, and we don't see self-care and holiday in that way at all. In fact, when you look at a lot of, benefits packages, it clearly communicates to us that, we believe that the longer you're here, the more days you earn, and you can lose days, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're very clear about how people should take days, women should take days. We could learn from a lot of other cultures who believe in this whole idea of stepping back, living your life, and then coming back fresh.
Thanks so much, Anissa. And then finally, one last question here is, why do you think it's so difficult to say no or to learn, how can one learn to say no and be assertive?
That's a big one, right? I think for a lot of us, we are socialized to be polite, be thoughtful, and to think about other people, right? There's an article going around the last 2 weeks about a mom who said that she's teaching her child to not share. And and a lot of people are having a strong reaction. But one of the points that I think is very unique is her idea about teaching her kid to say no. Not everything has to be given up for everyone else, for the good of everyone else, and there are times you have to take care of yourself. And one of the things I take from that and I emphasize in therapy with people is saying no doesn't necessarily mean that you have a certain type of reaction, because it's the reaction that we're, if I say no, it's the reaction. It doesn't mean that, and you're making assumptions about it. But when you say no, or you say that I need to do something because this is how it affects me, other people, really healthy-minded people respect that. They're oftentimes surprised, and they respect that. And I oftentimes give you concrete facts. After about 5 to 7 times of saying no, you can say no, and it feels much more better. So I say it's a practice thing, and it's also changing the way in which you look at the outcome of saying no. The outcome of saying no doesn't mean a negative response.
Right, and I think it's really about not really caring about the self-image, right? What people will think about you,
right?
And people's perception of you.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. Well, thank you, Anissa, and thank you, everyone. We appreciate your being here. Please note that the final session in our Wellness Webinar series will feature SJC alumna Dr. Laura Van Schaik Harmon and take place on July 19th with a focus on managing anxiety. Free of charge, you can sign up for the webinar at the address that's on your screen. We also welcome any ideas for future webinar topics and feedback, so please feel free to email us with your suggestions. We have a mentoring program. Our professional mentoring program connects our current students and interested alumni with mentors in their desired career fields. The program is a great way to gain firsthand experience and knowledge and network with professionals in one's field of interest. And for our mentors, it's a meaningful opportunity to share their personal and professional journey and open the door for career awareness and advice for our aspiring mentees. For more information about the program, please visit the link that's on your screen. And please don't forget to connect with us on social media for updates on all alumni events and happenings at the college. We'd like to thank Anissa once again for providing us with very helpful insights on job burnout.
Thank you. I think it's an important topic.
And thank you all for joining us today, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you.